This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Petrak, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Petrak. If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you've come to the right place. And I'm very excited about our guest today. His name is Jack West. He's the VP of Clinical Development at Summit Therapeutics. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. First of all, he holds an MD from Harvard Medical School, a master's degree from Cambridge, and an undergraduate from Princeton. Impressive to say the least. But also he was a practicing oncologist for 21 years before joining Summit Therapeutics. So he has insights from leading in a hospital setting and in a pharma setting, and he's here to share those insights with us. So Jack West, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Thanks so much. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, so we're just going to hop right in. You know, some of the people that listen to our podcast are trying to break into the pharmaceutical world in general. And in our pre-show discussion, you mentioned that you had some collaborations with pharma while you were in the clinic that were instrumental in you making that leap. What are some interactions that were really meaningful to you?
Well, over a couple of decades, I had a lot of experience in working on continuing medical education programs, developing the content, sometimes developing my own programs that needed pharma support. And then over a long period of years and years, being involved in advisory boards with various and sundry companies that give a sense of what the leading priorities are for our industry, partners when I was in the clinical world. And there's a reasonable amount of dovetailing, of mutual alignment of goals, but it's not perfect. And so I think it was really helpful for me to get a sense over years and years of what are the leading priorities for pharma companies by working closely with them in the CME programs and advisory boards. I also, about 18 years ago, started a nonprofit for cancer education called GRACE, Global Resource for Advancing Cancer Education. But like just about everything, ultimately relies on pharma company support. And it's always a balance of trying to do that while maintaining your credibility as an independent commentator.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, a lot of the people that I interact with that are customer facing, MSLs and so on, sometimes doing a speakers bureau or being involved with pharma in clinical trials or some way really does help, make that leap. And speaking of leaps, many of the leaders that I interview have taken some sort of big risk, some big leap that catapulted their career. And after 20 years of practicing medicine, I'm sure the leap to pharma was not an easy decision. What all went into that decision for you?
Well, for me, it was a combination of push and pull in that I was really ready for a change. The fact that it had been over 20 years in doing a lot of the same things. I am not exactly an adrenaline junkie, but I kind of feel like I needed something different. I can be a bit of a restless soul and wanted to have just new challenges. And after more than 20 years of being in the same cadence of so many of the same things, was ready to try something new. Just felt like I wasn't getting the same kind of satisfaction out of the 235th talk after, compared to your first several years where there's just more excitement for something that's new. It wasn't that new at that point. Now, at the same time, when I first looked at a job in pharma 20 years ago nearly, it was more of a risk for me in that I wasn't as well known. And the reality is that I think being in pharma in general requires some ability to accept volatility, that it's pretty unlikely to be at the same company for decades at a time. You have to accept the vagaries of things that you can't control and potentially moving from company to company, maybe place to place. And when I was at a much earlier point in my career, my kids were really young. One of them hadn't yet been born. And so that was a practical issue, that it wouldn't have been as easy for me to travel all over and potentially have to uproot the family to move to someplace else as needed. In contrast, at this point in my career, the later portion where I've been in the field for long enough that I really felt like my credibility, my reputation had been well established, and so wasn't going to be that subject to change with a year or so. Certainly could withstand the risks of working with a company and maybe having things not work out as well as you dream. But that I could do. My kids were no longer at an age where I need to read to them at night or anything like that. They're in college, ending college, things like that. So in that sense, it was an easier opportunity for me to take some risks, because even if I need to potentially jump from one opportunity to another over time, I'm not looking at decades of that.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. Timing is crucial. Where somebody is in their career, they're thought about potentially bouncing back if it doesn't work. But now that you're in, you made the jump, I'm sure there's some dynamic differences. Has there been any major differences?
Well, yes, of course, as you'd envision. So, and maybe even more so because I'm working in a small company that's got over 100 employees, but not hundreds, and certainly not thousands. And so I think it would be a very different experience if I were working in a very large company that just was on extremely solid footing. And that said, for me, I really value working in a small company environment. I love the agility, the hunger, and my ability to be heavily involved with a lot of the processes. I'm really about the only clinician there, the only person who's been treating patients in the recent past and a little bit ongoing. And for me, that has really defined my value for the company, especially, and but for me, just reinforced, what I can bring. But at the same time, it's a lot to learn. I will say that even though I came in with decades of having worked with companies and having a sense of the way the wind blows, the reality is when you have you really have skin in the game, it does require you to think a little differently than when you're in a clinical environment and an academic environment, and your questions may be more based on, it would be nice to know this and just to learn the science of it. Whereas in industry, you do need to be much more mindful of timelines and the size of markets and things like that. But I think that I enjoy working with these challenges. I mean, Lord knows in clinical oncology, you have this challenge of a cancer that you can know all the right treatments, and sometimes the cancer just shoves your best opinions and ideas aside, and you just work within the confines of what you have. I think that in the world of industry, you have a different set of challenges working on new opportunities and timelines. Really wanting to be as expeditious as possible. Working within the regulatory environment of what's permitted, and so it's just a whole new set of challenges. I don't think that is a bad thing. I think that just makes it a more challenging puzzle to work around.
Yeah, and in our pre-show discussion, you had a great analogy. You said going into a pharma company is like riding a mechanical bull. It's like the directions change frequently, and sometimes you're not ready for them. I thought that was a great illustration, really, for anybody that's thinking about moving into pharma.
working in
You want
a
to speak more on
smaller
that?
company. Yeah, I mean, just that, in a smaller company in particular, there's more volatility. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think depends on your mindset. But for me, as I said, it's hard for me to think that I'm kind of an adrenaline junkie about this stuff, but I do enjoy having it be so dynamic. I think that's what makes time go, it just blows quickly. It's been, for me, just my first year. I'm not even at the end of my first year, but it's gone like really quickly. And it reminds me of when I was a medical student doing like a surgery rotation. And to be clear, I'm not a surgeon, but the surgeons, I think, were exhilarated that you go in and the work you're doing is a little harried sometimes, but man, it goes quickly. All of a sudden you walk out and it's been 9 hours, and it just doesn't feel that way because it's been so exciting. And I feel like that's a really great thing if you're working in an area, in a corner of the pharma world where things are really happening quickly, and it's really holding on to learn more, and just a ton happening. But it really makes the time go quickly because it's so exciting.
Yeah, that's important. And I'm sure that some of the people that will be watching this because of who you are still going to be in practice. And if you don't mind me saying, when you were a clinician, you were a bit outspoken, critical even regarding best practices and developing and conducting clinical trials. But now that you're on the industry side, what are the challenges in running trials from your point of view?
Well, I think that's been one of the things that is a learning experience of working in a different environment. But I really appreciate about social media that, whatever I say, I said what I said and I meant it. I'll stand by it. And I appreciate being challenged with my prior views, which I think have been focused on things like the appropriateness of crossover, even potentially mandated crossover, quality of the control arm, whether that's a really contemporary one or not. And those were some of the things that I had the strongest feelings about, as well as post-protocol therapy, et cetera. But, those were the things that I want to stand by. And I was hired by a company, Summit knew these things about me, and they welcomed me in, knowing my positions. And I think that for a company that was so small and relatively essentially unknown in the cancer space previously, they needed to get some name recognition, a foot in the door in the clinical world. And I think that being known as somebody who was a bit of a hard driver, a stickler, et cetera, at least gave some credibility and the opportunity for me to get a foot in the door talking with my colleagues who know that I was not going to, I hope they know I wasn't going to make any about faces and cave in on my prior convictions, but I really work on those things from within now. That said, there are some realities, particularly working with a company that Summit works very closely with a partner, Akeso Bio, in China. And, the standards of care for maybe the initial workup and can be different in China. So that is a learning experience of not being able to necessarily boil the ocean and change, the way everyone does everything, but at the same time trying to enforce the standards that I believed in as a clinician. And I don't think that our standards should be fundamentally different depending on your vantage point. I mean, what is optimal treatment or a standard of care for a staging, et cetera, should not change depending on, shouldn't be compromised depending on where you're working. So I'm trying, and it's been fortunate that I've had such a receptive work environment, and they're living by that. So we are doing trials that have strong endpoints, good control arms, bold trials, and I'm just glad to be working in a setting that will accept that challenge.
That's great. This episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. You know, the Pharmaverse podcast is a leadership podcast, so I want to get into some of your leadership best practices because you really have such a unique experience being, you know, so close in to the clinic and then also new to pharma. But when you think about no matter what setting you're in, what do you think are some of the keys to success when leading people?
I think that one of the most important things is just having well-defined roles and a clear value. That the reality is that there are some things that I bring to the teams that are unique strengths of mine. But that said, I am absolutely not the one with the most experience or knowledge, the depth of working a decade or more in industry, and I have a lot to learn about that. So the reality is that there's tons of moving parts. Just about everyone in this audience will know that there's so many components to the process, many different groups. And as a clinician, I don't think I really focused very much on all of these aspects of what is required, but it's a ton to learn. So I come in with the confidence of what I can bring as a clinician, but the humility that I have tons still to learn from my colleagues. And I'm just gratified to be working with people who are great at what they do. And I think that if everyone feels valued, that really goes a long way. I think that's not unique to pharma. That's just everyone would like to be in a job where they feel extremely valued. I think that's a challenge in the clinical and academic world sometimes, that when it gets to be more and more RVUs and you got to do more with less, and it can feel it's not, at least in the pharma world, it's a corporate environment, and sadly I think that the academic world has become as corporate as well, but you didn't necessarily knowingly enter it that way. So, but I think that the biggest thing is to just have your own sense of value of what you bring, and feel that value for other people. And for me personally, I think it's really great to cultivate an environment where everyone is open. And, I'm somebody who says what I think, but I want to value that in everybody. I encourage other people to challenge me, as I said, whether it's something I said on Twitter or X, or I have a view. I don't mean to imply that that's the only view, and I really appreciate people having the conviction and courage to disagree and raise their points. I would also say that whether it is on an online discussion or at a meeting, that it's a great thing to learn people's views and maybe modify your own based on that. That's not flip-flopping. That's just integrating new information to change your perspective. And to me, that is the whole premise of what science is about. Again, not every trial is going to be a tremendous success. You run studies, you learn from them. Sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're not. But at least if you're asking good questions and you can learn from the new information coming to you, that is forward progress.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you want to make people feel valued, and you want them to value your opinion too, I mean, that's a two-way street. You got to lead by example. Any other specific examples of you sort of setting the foundation for that open culture where people are free to share ideas? Anything that you lead by example in that way?
Well, I would just say that I try to invite dissent or counter views by not just saying that this is what I think, and does everyone agree with this? Rather, I would say here's what I might think. In fact, ideally, I would present a few different ways of thinking and invite people to vote for or articulate whatever they choose before I place my bet, just so that I don't want to unduly influence everybody. But in situations where my views are already known, I think just by presenting a series of options rather than this is my view, everyone thumbs up on that is I think a kind of one directional, and I don't want to be that. I'd really like to have people positively decide that that what I'm thinking is the way to go, and if that's the case and it's by voting down some of the alternatives, then fine. But I would like to present the alternatives as very reasonable alternative ways to think, because I want to encourage people that is an appropriate other angle, and that they should feel free to support that and argue why.
Yeah, I really like that nugget, like not to present your own thought first.
Yeah.
I think that's a great leadership bit of advice. And many of the listeners that we have for this podcast are aspiring leaders. There's someone that wants to be a leader, but just doesn't really, they feel maybe stuck in their situation or the right opportunity hasn't come to them. And you spoke a lot about this in our pre-show discussion. What are some advice that you would give to somebody that feels frustrated and kind of stuck in their situation?
I think that a lot of opportunities can and do come to people just with time and experience. I mean, for me too, it's something that I didn't just drop out of the sky, but whatever confidence I have in my perspective comes out of kind of battle testing some of these things over a long period of time, and the discussions, debates that I've had on social media or at live meetings are, I feel, very constructive, and I again welcome people to pursue their counter arguments, and I think somebody who is comfortable saying, okay, that's a good alternative way, and I wasn't thinking of it that way, and consider me revised in my opinion, and I don't feel any shame in that. But just to say that that you need to accumulate that over some time and experience. But beyond that, I think for me, for anybody, I think it is appropriate to be somewhat bold, and by this I mean I think a lot of us tend to be too complacent about just inertia, just staying where we are, doing what we've been doing, and really needing to think that there are opportunity costs to not taking the more aggressive approach, and I think that just kind of the open mouth gets fed mentality that you can often do better for yourself by advocating for yourself and trying to think of and change your trajectory to what you want. Now, I would say also very kind of implicit with that is clarifying for yourself what you really want, and whether that's in 2 years or 5 years or 8 years or 10 years. But if you don't know that, you're going to be rudderless. You need to really be honest with yourself about what your strengths are and what they are not, and what's realistic to pursue, but then to not be too timid to do what you need to do to try to follow that path. So with that as well, I think it's as much about what projects to pursue, how to do things differently, but also what to say no to. And I think this certainly applies in clinical world, in academia. I mean, there's tons of committees that you can be voluntold to do, and I think maybe in pharma too. In just about everything, there's tasks that that you can be asked to do just to be a team player. And of course, we all want to be team players, but nobody wants to be taken advantage of, and you don't want all those things that you are unenthusiastic about and anybody can do to compete with the real value add for yourself. So I think it's important to clarify, what do you actually want to do and be in the next X years, and to do that, what do you need to do differently and better and pursue, and what do you need to pare down on and actively trim that are competing, the good being the enemy of the great, etc.
I really like that illustration of being rudderless, because I tell people all the time too, if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know what the strategy is for where you're going, then everything sort of sounds good. And you might make a bad move. I think it was Yogi Berra that said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So you really have to know where the destination is, so you know what to say yes and no to. That's a really good point. I like rudderless. But another question is aching at me to ask you is, like, now that you've had all this clinical experience, and now that you have some pharma experience, your view of things has expanded. And what do you see are like the top challenges, the top things that are facing the pharma universe, the Pharmaverse, as we say around here? What are those challenges now that you're in industry?
Yeah, so for the world of, for the industry itself, and not as much me personally, I would say that, the biggest issues are, well, I think there are many. Sorry, let me just say that again. I would say that the world of regulatory approvals is evolving, that we are working with FDA, their own priorities and guidelines may change over time, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But if things are changing, then we need to follow potentially new rules. There's debates about what are the most appropriate endpoints, and those debates can be what is most expeditious for the company, what is most clinically meaningful for patients and clinicians, what is acceptable to the regulatory authorities, etc. For us personally, but I think also pretty broad, that are coming from, say, China. And as I said, we are working very closely with Akeso Bio, and in the past there have been data coming from China that have not been enthusiastically pursued or accepted, maybe by clinicians. Understandable, there may be genetic differences. There's certainly some practice differences in, say, how patients are worked up post-operative or post-trial therapies, et cetera. How broadly to generalize, how comfortably to generalize data coming from other parts of the world is an issue. We have questions about in the preoperative, perioperative world, which is a big focus in lung cancer, which is my particular interest, debates about how important it is to show the contribution of phase to the is especially uniquely, independently valuable versus the postoperative, versus bundling it all together and saying, well, as a package deal, pre-op and post-op is helpful. And so that's an area where FDA has, I think, been struggling about how rigid to be about the contribution of one phase of treatment over another. And then finally, there's been a changing role for patients, and I think this is largely a good thing, that patients, even though this is all ostensibly and importantly for them, did not have as direct a voice. It's not maybe as good as it could be, but it's better than it used to be for patients having some agency and saying, what are the endpoints, what are the patient related outcomes that really matter to them and how to incorporate them. So this is all a work in progress, and looking back to the regulatory environment and general guidelines of how things were more than a decade ago don't necessarily apply anymore. So I think that it is a changing world, and the pharma companies really need to adapt to that.
There's a lot of, like you said, a lot of challenges. I really like that point about, whether to accept or not to accept, data that's coming from maybe other parts of the world. That kind of leads me to our last question here. Summit Therapeutics has had some positive news recently, positive press releases about the bispecific antibody that you're developing with Akeso. What has it been like to be in the middle of that tornado of activity and this small company sharing such big news?
It's been great. I would say that I work with a chief medical officer who has a lot more experience in pharma, having been doing this for a couple of decades or more in many companies. And he said we had a very favorable press release just before ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, biggest cancer meeting of the year. And right before that, it got some very favorable news about a Chinese-run trial that directly compares ivonescimab, our bispecific antibody working with Akeso, to pembrolizumab, which has been an incredibly respected and very successful checkpoint inhibitor, not just in lung cancer, but amazingly successful in a huge number of indications in various cancers. So going up head-to-head in a monotherapy trial and demonstrating superiority by progression-free survival is a big statement. We still have to show the actual data, which are anticipated to be available to the public and will be shown at a meeting in September. But between now and then, just having to grow our operations to fill the needs of a program that suddenly has huge implications of all the other trials that we need to move on in lung cancer. And as I said, the implications being that this could be really valuable in lots of areas, but it's not a large company. And so figuring out how to execute on that promise is a champagne problem to have. But being in the room where it happens has been wildly exciting. And so, as I was saying, working with a colleague, working under a chief medical officer who's been at 6 companies or so over 20 years, that I've been waiting my life for a day like this, and you just stumble in and have it, have it a banner year or a once in a career kind of event. I mean, that's great. I'll take it when it's so providential. But it's extremely exciting to be somewhere where you're really at the ground level and frantically have to build a bigger, better program to answer all these questions that have suddenly become imperative, and learning about the business side of how to execute on a higher level, even if you're a smaller company. So I'm not as directly involved with the business decisions, but I am seeing some of that. And as I say, there's just so much to learn. It's one of the things I like about being in a smaller company is that I'm privy to tons of new things to learn about, and it's kind of the drinking from a fire hose issue. But again, that's a much better problem than sitting on your hands waiting for relatively minor things to happen.
Yeah, well, I was at ASCO. I can attest. Summit Therapeutics was all the buzz there. But with my eye on the clock here, unfortunately, Jack, that's all the time we have. But really, on behalf of all in the Pharmaverse, I really want to thank you for your time and for your valuable insights. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we're all going to follow you on social media. It sounds like X, LinkedIn, any others?
No, those are the main ones, yeah. Jack West, MD. So great, yeah. And thanks for the opportunity.
That wraps up another episode. Many more great leaders lined up for you. So please continue to follow the podcast so you don't miss any one of them. Thanks for listening. See you next time on the Pharmaverse. Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.